On August 17, 1983, it was an ordinary evening in Toronto, Ontario, and a family was preparing the dinner table for Susan Tice, a 45-year-old mother of four. Susan's absence without communication was unusual. Susan's family became concerned when she did not arrive after several hours and sent her brother-in-law to check on her. When he arrived at Susan's house, he was shocked to his core to find Susan's body in her bedroom, lying in a pool of blood. Months later, Erin Gilmore's body was discovered in her apartment by her boyfriend, Anthony Monk, on a chilly night in December. Anthony was scheduled to pick up his 22-year-old girlfriend for a date on December 20, 1983, at approximately 9 p.m., following her shift at the clothes store where she worked. When Anthony finally made it to Erin's apartment at around 9:30 p.m., he found her lifeless body wrapped in a blanket. What was the true fate of Susan and Erin? Were Erin and Susan acquainted? For the past 39 years, the families of the victims and the police have been asking the same questions. Ontario is a province in southeast Canada, with its capital city being Toronto. In addition to being the most populous city in Canada, it is also the financial, commercial, and trading hub of the nation. Toronto is a fantastic destination for everyone because of its renowned theatre, music, and art scenes. However, this lovely location is also the scene of almost 700 cold case murders. Regrettably, we will examine two of these horrifying murders from 1983 today. In Toronto, this is where our case begins. The daughter of Dr. Burton Williscroft and the former Jane Wallace of Leith, Susan O'Hara Williscroft Tice, was born on November 13, 1937. In 1961, she tied the knot with Fred Tice. When Susan passed away in 1983, she was 45 years old and a mother of 4 children. Her 4 children, Ben, John, Christian, and Jason, were the source of her warmth and joy, as well as the admiration and affection of her friends and family. She was regarded as the person who brought everyone together and someone they looked up to. Her kids' friends used to refer to her as May or Mrs. T. Susan. She was a nurse in Calgary, and she divorced her husband, the father of her 4 children, in July 1983. She left Toronto shortly after that, deciding to return to her hometown. Susan began serving the families of people with underprivileged children there as a family therapist. Christian, Susan's daughter, and her were particularly close and had a special bond. However, they had no idea that a catastrophe was going to occur. On August 17, 1983, a calm evening, Susan's family was busy preparing the dinner table for a get-together. Hours went by, and Susan never showed up, which alarmed her relatives. They became concerned because Susan was usually reliable and would never skip out on them. They chose to wait for her, but after several hours went by with no sign of Susan, her family began to suspect that something was not quite right. To make sure Susan was all right, her brother-in-law got in his car and headed to her home at 341 Grey Street. The entire scene appeared a little strange as he arrived. It appeared like no one was home because there was a mountain of unopened mail and no lights on. When no one answered the door, he knocked again. Figuring Susan must not have been home, he attempted to peer in through the windows, but it was too dark. He chose to enter through the back door after deciding that something was not quite right. To his surprise, the door was wide open. Her brother-in-law was still searching for her when all of a sudden her phone rang. When he answered, it was Susan's daughter Christian, phoning from her summer camp. Christian asked her uncle where her mother was, to which he gave no answer. He eventually located Susan in the upstairs bedroom. There she was, unconscious in a puddle of her own blood. Without delay, Susan's brother-in-law contacted the police. When the police got to Susan's house, they started working right away. The police conducted a thorough search inside and outside the home and discovered no evidence of forced entry. Susan had suffered multiple chest stab wounds, in addition to sexual assault. There was no sign of the murder weapon. The only person who saw anything was Susan's neighbor, who could provide them with some details. She claimed to have heard a woman scream 4 times at 1:30 in the morning and to have heard someone pass Susan's house, but she did not believe it was a reason to call the police. A DNA sample taken from the semen left at the crime scene was the only proof the police could find. The police department was unable to find Susan's killer using this information alone. The police had no suspects or leads. Since there were no suspects in Susan's case, police began questioning Susan's co-workers and relatives to see if they had any information regarding the case. The investigator considered Fred Tice, Susan's ex-husband, as a potential suspect. However, he was quickly exonerated after it was discovered where he was when the crime was committed. The police force appeared to be in a loop, lacking fresh information, suspects, or witnesses, and their investigations consistently appeared to come to a standstill. The police department left the case open in the hopes that someone would contact them with information. The investigators searched for any small hints or information that would point them in the direction of Susan's murderer. They kept waiting, but nothing materialized. The media also reported on the case in the hopes that someone would come forward with information, but they were disappointed. Everyone was shocked by Susan's case, not only her own family, but also the family with whom she worked. The police department and Susan's family were deeply troubled by the idea that someone had escaped punishment for killing someone. After several months, Susan's case appeared to be at a standstill. Her case file was added to the long list of unresolved cold cases that would eventually be forgotten. Regretfully, Susan's family was left in the dark and uninformed. Susan Tice was laid to rest in Grey County, Ontario, Canada's Leith United Church Cemetery. The daughter of David and Anna Gilmore, Erin Harrison Gilmore, was born on February 3, 1961. In 1983, 22-year-old Erin was a blonde with a captivating demeanor and a promising future. According to her brothers, Sean and Callan McCowan, she was a natural beauty who was always full of life and an incredible friend to everyone around her. Despite being driven by her career, she never compromised on her commitment to her family. Erin was a bright, content young woman. She was employed at Robbins Knits, a clothes store, in 1983 and had aspirations of becoming a fashion designer. The store was at 37 Bits Hazelton Avenue, directly below her apartment. She worked there to expand her skills as a model and designer and to obtain experience in the field. She was dating Anthony Monk at the time. Anthony was the son of Peter Monk, the business partner of her father, David Gilmore. Erin Gilmore was the sole child of business magnate David Gilmore, who amassed his wealth by founding one of the biggest coal mining firms globally. Erin spent a lot of time with her father and they had a very close relationship. They were unaware that disaster was lurking around the corner. Erin Gilmore was discovered dead on December 20, 1983, 5 days before Christmas, and just 4 months after Susan's murder. Erin had invited her 2 half-brothers, Sean and Callan McCowan, over for a sleepover at her Hazelton Avenue apartment on the evening of December 19, 1983. For the 3 of them, this acted as a ritual, and the brothers used to take pleasure in spending time with Erin. With Christmas quickly approaching, everyone was looking forward to the joyous occasion. Before turning in for the night, they snacked on popcorn and watched movies. The following morning, Erin dropped Callan off at home and dropped Sean off at the market because he needed to shop for Christmas. He had no idea that this would be his last glimpse of his sister in good health. Erin went back home, started working at Robbins Knits, and went about her day as usual. She was expected to close the store at the end of her shift, which meant she would be the last person there at around 9 o'clock. Anthony Monk, Erin's boyfriend, had promised to pick her up from the store at 9 o'clock p.m. for their date, but he was about 20 minutes late because he had to stop by an ATM to get cash. Upon arriving at the store, he expected Erin to be waiting for him, but he did not see her. Anthony guessed that she had gone upstairs to get ready for their date. After climbing the stairs to Erin's apartment, Anthony noticed something strange. The main door was ajar. Though Erin's lack of caution was unusual, he could not help but wonder if she had accidentally left the door open for him. Anthony entered and glanced around, but he was unable to locate Erin. He called her name several times, but Erin never answered. When Anthony opened the bedroom door, he saw that the blanket was rolled up in the center of the bed, even though she was not there. Fearing the worst, Anthony approached it and tugged at the blanket's edges. His worst fears were realized. Erin was covered in a blanket and was not answering. It was not until Anthony noticed the blood leaking from under the blanket onto the bed that he realized what had happened. Fearing for his life, Anthony did not hesitate to dial the police. Upon arriving at Erin's apartment, the police discovered that Erin had been killed and had been wrapped in a blanket. Erin also suffered from both murder and sexual assault. In this instance as well, police discovered semen at the crime scene, which served as DNA evidence. The police did not discover any evidence of a forced entry or break-in when they inspected the crime scene. Erin had suffered several chest stab wounds, in addition to being strangled. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found, and there were no witnesses or suspects. The fact that everything that occurred with Erin that night transpired in a mere 20 minutes startled the police department the most. The person who attacked and killed Erin was able to get away with it between Erin closing the store at 9 p.m. and Anthony arriving at 9:20 p.m. It was going to be difficult for the police to find Erin's killer with the amount of information and evidence they had. Erin's case differed from Susan's in that it received more media coverage and publicity. The sole child of business magnate David Gilmore, a well-known person in Toronto at the time, was Erin Gilmore. When the police first questioned Erin's relatives and co-workers, they discovered nothing strange. Because Erin's body was covered in a blanket, a tactic used by killers to help them cope with their guilt, Anthony, Erin's boyfriend, was considered a suspect in Erin's case by the police. However, Anthony was ultimately exonerated and removed from the suspect list. It appeared that the investigation was going nowhere. By now, the police were desperate to apprehend this horrifying murderer. The publicity on Erin's case brought in a lot of new leads and suspects. The investigators questioned over 700 people in connection to Erin's case, but all were eliminated one by one. Due to the lack of evidence or any proof, the police were unable to find a potential suspect. Going around in circles, Erin's case also went cold. Although the police found the similarities unsettling, they did not initially link Susan and Erin's cases together. The police did not find a connection between these two cases until 2000. The police deduced that the same individual killed and assaulted Susan and Erin by using cutting-edge DNA testing technology. The investigators discovered a perfect match between the DNA samples taken from the two crime scenes after analyzing the samples. The Canadian DNA database contained no additional matches, despite the fact that the two DNA samples matched exactly. This led to a number of new inquiries. The police department was now interested in learning if this unidentified man had committed any other crimes in the 1980s, if he had committed any prior crimes, if he had committed any since 1983, and if he was still at large. The Toronto Police Department announced in November 2008 that they would pay $50,000 to anyone with information that would lead them to Erin and Susan's killer. Unfortunately, not many people remembered or knew about the crime, and because it had been so long ago. Over the past few decades, there has been a notable decrease in the amount of publicity surrounding these cases. When an informant failed to surface, despite the police department's best efforts, Erin's family contributed and in 2012 the reward was raised to $200,000. However, not even that prize was claimed. There was a group of detectives who were committed to bringing Erin and Susan's killer to justice, even though everyone had given up on ever finding their killer. Police even received a tip suggesting that Erin and Susan may have met their killer at the Yorkville area bars and restaurants, where they both frequented on a regular basis. Police concluded that the murderer either knew the women personally or had figured out where they lived because both were killed in their own houses without any indication of a break-in. However, this was only one of several scenarios in which the crimes could have occurred. Shun and Callan McCowan, Erin Gilmore's brothers, were in close communication with Detective Sergeant Steve Smith. Since the killings of Erin and Susan were connected in 2000 by the police, the case has slowly advanced but has remained among the unsolved cases. The investigators posted a call to action on YouTube in March of 2016, inviting anyone with information to come forward. Once more, this had no outcome. Though they were unaware that the police department was already working on this, Shun and Callan McCowan contacted Detective Smith later in 2020 to inquire about the possibility of using genetic genealogy to find their sister's killer. With assistance from Othram, an American company that specializes in using forensic genealogy to solve unsolved murders, disappearances, and the identification of unidentified murder victims, the investigators used forensic genetic genealogy in 2019. Othram then used only the minuscule DNA strands that had been collected at the crime scenes to create a broad DNA profile using forensic grade genome sequencing. In 2022, Toronto police used the extensive DNA profile that Othram had created to trace the DNA back to two sets of grandparents. At the time, the police were rummaging through the DNA profiles that had already been uploaded on various Canadian DNA databases in the hopes of finding a match that could point them in the direction of the killer, if not a distant relative. Thus, they deduced that the murderer of Erin and Susan had ties to one of these four individuals. The investigators wasted no time in getting to work and thoroughly searching the family tree until they found a family branch that appeared to be very likely the killer's. The investigators discovered a generation of 5 brothers, thanks to this family branch. These 5 brothers were the only candidates left on the Toronto Police Department's list of potential suspects after much effort. They were fairly certain that one of these 5 brothers had murdered Erin and Susan, but they could not identify the culprit without obtaining a DNA sample from each brother. The police department's efforts to obtain the 5 brothers' DNA were going to be difficult because they needed a court order to obtain the samples directly, and the court was not going to grant them a warrant based on the limited evidence they had. The 5 brothers' DNA samples were surreptitiously obtained by the Toronto Police Department using beer cans, glasses, and other items. 4 of the brothers' DNA samples were successfully obtained, but the 5th sample eluded them. Joseph George Sutherland was the 5th brother. After testing every DNA sample they had gathered, the investigators were able to rule out each of the 4 brothers as the murderer one at a time. Even though they were now certain that Joseph was the murderer, they still required a sample of his DNA to support their claims. Using the samples they had taken from the other 4 brothers, the Toronto Police Department then devised a plan. The detectives requested a warrant, reasoning that since the 5th brother was most likely the one who killed Susan and Erin, all the other brothers had been ruled out as suspects. The judge granted the request and gave the detectives a warrant so they could ask Joseph Sutherland for a DNA sample after considering the research, the investigation, and the detectives' progress in the case. They all raced to Moosonee, Ontario, where Joseph resided at the time, to take a sample of his DNA. The detectives exhaled with relief upon receiving the results. They had finally found their man. The DNA sample recovered from the crime scenes of Susan and Erin exactly matched Joseph's sample. After suffering for nearly 40 years, the murderer of Susan and Erin now had a name and a face. In December 1961, Joseph George Sutherland was born in Fort Albany, Ontario. He had moved to Moosonee, Ontario not long ago. Joseph went to Humber College in Tobicoke, Ontario, and Northern Lights Secondary School in Moosonee, Ontario. He had been leading a modest life in Moosonee, about 850 kilometers north of Toronto, for the entire time. He used social media to communicate frequently. He was charged with killing Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore, as well as sexually abusing them. If Joseph was the murderer after all, he was only 21 years old when he killed Erin and Susan. Joseph Sutherland, then 61 years old, was taken into custody by the police on November 25, 2022, after they showed up at his Moosonee home on November 24, 2022. Joseph was accused of killing Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore twice in the first degree. He is presently awaiting trial and is being housed as a prisoner at the Toronto South Detention Centre. Joseph's lack of prior criminal history has also been mentioned, which helps to explain why his DNA was not included in the Canadian DNA database. When Sean and Callan McCowan learned of Joseph's arrest, they were overjoyed. Detective Smith called Sean to let him know about the arrest, and Sean was ecstatic. At last, there was relief, along with a great deal of happy tears and profanity. Sean recalled how, overcome with rage, he had punched a hole in the wall the day his mother had told him about his sister's murder. All he wanted was for his mother, who died 2 years ago, to be present to witness this day. Susan's only daughter, Christian, has become a mother herself. She felt relieved to learn that her mother's killer had finally been apprehended. All she wanted was for Susan to be present so she could meet her grandchildren. Whenever she visited her mother's home, she would frequently go up and down the stairs in an attempt to piece together exactly what had happened. Christian still sleeps in the corner of her room with a baseball bat because she is afraid for her safety, but that has finally stopped. When Christian heard the news, she gave her mother's picture a fist bump and exclaimed, "We got him." Susan's closest friend back then was Anne Chisholm, who is now 85 years old. They first became friends as teenagers at Camp Wapameo in Algonquin Provincial Park. The weekend before Susan was killed, Anne had gone to see her, and she was going to see her again the following weekend. In an expression of her sorrow, Anne said that it was depressing and sad that while she had a great life over the years, her best friend Susan had not been given the same chance. The news of Joseph's arrest also relieved Anne. Detective Smith said that Joseph appeared to have anticipated being arrested when questioned about it. Detective Smith added that this was the most complicated case the Toronto police had handled in his 25 years of service, having spent the last 39 years living in Ontario. The Toronto Police Department has announced that they are investigating all other unsolved murder cases in the province to determine whether Joseph is linked to any of them. Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore were two lovely, hard-working people whose lives were taken far too soon. However, they can both now rest easy knowing that their killer has been apprehended by the police following a protracted and agonizing journey. Genetic genealogy technology progress aided the investigators and was crucial to the case's resolution. The investigators narrowed down a possible suspect family and eventually worked their way down to a single suspect with the aid of a small strand of DNA. Genetic genealogy is a technology that will continue to advance and get better over time. It will undoubtedly be crucial in solving a lot of these kinds of cold cases. Do you believe Joseph might have been involved in more murders in Ontario that are still unsolved? What do you suppose could have motivated Joseph to commit such crimes at such young age?
A 39-year-old woman known only as Jane Doe was getting ready for bed alone in her Charlotte, North Carolina, home on Friday, June 17, 1994. Her kids had not come home yet, and it was already 1:30 in the morning. The woman made the decision to go to bed because she had a long day. In order to allow her children to enter her home without waking her, the woman left her main door unlocked. She calmly tucked herself into bed after bringing out her favorite blanket, not realizing that a predator was waiting for prey outside in the shadows. In a matter of seconds, the woman discovered that an unidentified intruder had her at knife point. What did this intruder want, and who was he? Was the 39-year-old mother going to live to tell about this potentially fatal experience? Charlotte is the most populated city in the American state of North Carolina. Charlotte is renowned for having a big city feel and for having a warm population. Nevertheless, it is among the most dangerous cities for violent crimes, which stands in stark contrast to Charlotte's vibrant and friendly side. Over 91% of the communities in the North Carolina region are safer and have lower crime rates than Charlotte. And one of the most horrifying crimes in history happened here back in 1994. On June 17, 1994, a Friday, the 39-year-old woman was by herself at her Charlotte home on North Clodman Street. After finishing her housework, she waited for her kids to get home. She just wanted to get a good night's sleep because she had such a long day and was exhausted. The woman chose to leave her front door unlocked at 1:30 a.m. so that her children could enter when they got back. As she dozed off in bed, the sound of her bedroom door opening startled her out of her reverie. She briefly believed that her kids had returned home, but when she turned to look in the other direction, she saw a man standing by the door with a knife in his hand. She was terrified and unsure of what to do. The man approached her more closely in a matter of moments, put the knife to her throat, and attacked her. The woman was too terrified to act at that precise moment, but she immediately reported the attack to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department after the attacker left the house. The 39-year-old lady was brought in for a forensic evaluation, during which her body was examined. An assault kit was finished, and the assaulter's DNA was extracted. Medical examiners examined the DNA sample, but the analysis was not very helpful because DNA technology was still in its infancy, and there was not much data in their databases. Detectives from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department continued to hunt for the attacker after that, but they were unable to find him. They were unable to generate a list of possible suspects based on the evidence they had. The 39-year-old mother's attacker remained elusive to the detectives for weeks, months, and even years. The victim was left feeling distressed and powerless when the case finally ended without any progress being made for a very long period. In 2018, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in North Carolina reopened the 1994 assault case with the hope that the suspect could now be located thanks to advancements in DNA technology. They re-examined the evidence over the course of that year and ran some more tests on the suspect's DNA sample. A DNA profile was created by forensic scientists in 2019 and uploaded to the databases of the Combined DNA Index System, or simply CODIS. This established a link between the 1994 assault of the 39-year-old woman and the 2010 assault case. An unidentified man kidnapped a 25-year-old woman on March 13, 2010, from the 300 block of Hardin Street in Columbia, South Carolina, which is close to the University of South Carolina. Afterwards, the man attacked the woman and left the area. When the woman called the Columbia Police Department to report the incident, she made an effort to provide as much detail as she could about the man who had assaulted her. However, with the information available at the time, the detectives were unable to identify a suspect. The woman was given an assault examination by forensic experts, who also collected a sample of the suspect's DNA. After creating a DNA profile, this sample of DNA was added to the CODIS databases. Nevertheless, the 1994 case was reopened in 2019, which is when the two cases were connected. Testing conducted in 2019 demonstrated that the same man was responsible for both attacks. The investigators still needed to identify a suspect or person of interest, despite the fact that the investigation had progressed considerably. Detectives worked extremely hard in the ensuing years to identify the suspect, and in 2022, with a little assistance, they succeeded. The CMPD collaborated closely with the nationwide Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, or SAKI, in 2022. SAKI provided financial support to the CMPD and trained detectives in the use of forensic genetic genealogy to identify a subject, An American company called Ulthrim Corporation, which specialized in forensic genetic genealogy, received a sample of the suspect's DNA. A thorough genealogical profile of the unidentified suspect was constructed by Ulthrim scientists using forensic-grade genome sequencing. To generate a list of possible leads, the Ulthrim genealogy team searched their databases using a genetic genealogy technique. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department received the list. James Wayne Ingersol, 50, was quickly marked as a person of interest by detectives after they thoroughly examined every individual on the list, running background checks and looking through criminal records. James was living in Concord, North Carolina, after being fired from his job in Columbia, when the detective knocked on his door and demanded a sample of James' DNA. After being gathered, a sample was submitted to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Crime Laboratory for additional analysis and comparison. The outcomes of these analyses showed that the DNA samples taken from James and the samples from the 1994 and 2010 attacks matched exactly. The suspect for the assaults on the 39-year-old mother in Charlotte and the 25-year-old woman in Columbia has been identified as James Wayne Ingersol by the CMPD's Crime Lab and Cold Case Unit after years of intensive forensic testing and evidence examination. Based on his criminal history, James was looked into for a peeping incident in 1995 and entered a guilty plea to assault on a female in 1999. But the latter case was dropped. James' arrest warrant was obtained by Special Victims Unit investigators with the Columbia Police Department, and on Thursday, May 4, 2023, the 50-year-old suspect was taken into custody by the Concord, North Carolina Police Department, CMPD, and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED. James' arrest was reported to both of his victims. They were relieved that their attacker would now have to pay for his crimes after eluding the law for almost 30 years. As a member of the detective team working on the 1994 cold case, Sergeant Darrell Price executed James' arrest in concert with other detectives from his department. He claimed that James was not surprised in the slightest by the arrest. Sergeant Darrell believed that James knew he was being sought by the police when CMPD caught him, and that James had been tipped off by some individuals who had seen the department's public assistance request. Sergeant Darrell Price had spent 13 years as an employee of the CMPD Cold Case Unit. Only 6 weeks away from retirement after 42 years in law enforcement, he was pleased to have contributed to the resolution of one of his final cases. W.H. Skip Holbrook, the chief of police in Columbia, South Carolina, declared that James Wayne Ingersol would face charges of first-degree criminal sexual conduct and kidnapping. James would also be charged in Mecklenburg County Superior Court with first-degree assault and burglary. Currently housed in the Mecklenburg County Detention Center, Ingersol's bond has been set at $600,000 by a North Carolina judge. The detectives are currently working to get an extradition warrant from the governor's office so that James can be charged in Columbia, because he has refused to waive extradition. The investigation is still active and ongoing into both of these cases in order to find more evidence that connects James to these crimes. The Columbia and Charlotte-Mecklenburg police departments had asked anyone with more information about the case to come forward. According to CMPD assault cold case investigator Sergeant Darrell Price, this was the third instance in which an arrest resulted from a novel form of genealogy testing. He continued by saying that the department is still looking into more than 3,000 assault cold cases. He was optimistic that the development of DNA technology would eventually prove to be very helpful in cracking many of those unsolved cases. Unfortunately, attacks similar to the one that took place in this case were not uncommon. Also sharing her heartbreaking tale was Lily Milhouse, who had moved into the Charlotte, North Carolina neighborhood where the 39-year-old mother had been attacked nearly 30 years prior. The now 70-year-old Lily claimed that even though she was only a teenager when she was assaulted, the memories of that terrible day still torment her. She experienced the same suffering as James's victims did, despite having no connection to the assaults that he committed. Lily wished for the closure of James' victims, knowing that he had been arrested for his crimes. She also disclosed that although the accused in her case was ultimately apprehended, the damage his acts caused was irreversible. Do you believe James Wayne Ingersol committed any other crimes that were never solved and he was never connected to them? Why, in your opinion, did it take the investigators nearly 30 years to identify James?